The millionaire's regret. A father's redemption. Edward Sterling adjusted his tie for the third time, his hands trembling as he stood at the entrance of the grand ballroom. Inside, soft classical music, the clinking of champagne glasses, and the hushed conversations of distinguished guests in black tie resonated. He took a deep breath before stepping in, forcing a smile onto his face. 6 months ago, Edward was the CEO of one of the nation's most prosperous tech companies. His name graced every financial publication. His phone buzzed constantly with audacious proposals and invitations to exclusive events. In his prime, he was a man of immense power, untouchable, or so he believed. At 30, Edward attended this charity event not as a leading figure, but as a ghost of his past. After a catastrophic investment, his company collapsed, leaving him ruined and disgraced. The luxurious penthouse, the sports cars, even the bespoke suits that once defined him, were all gone. Only the soft hum of defeat echoed in his mind. As Edward scanned the room, he spotted a familiar face at the far end. A woman with deep brown hair cascading over her shoulders, wearing a sophisticated black gown. His heart pounded with a sharp ache. Isabella. But it wasn't just her presence that stopped him cold. Standing beside her, holding her hand, was a small boy with soft blonde hair and piercing blue eyes. Eyes identical to those Edward saw reflected in his own mirror. His breath hitched. A crushing sensation seized his chest. Impossible. It can't be. Isabella hadn't seen him yet. But Edward couldn't tear his gaze from the boy. The resemblance was undeniable. A frantic throb pounded in his chest. Could this child be his son? Edward Sterling's journey to triumph had always seemed destined. Born in London, he grew up as the only son of Richard Sterling, a successful property magnate who amassed his wealth in real estate. From a very young age, Edward found himself surrounded by high expectations and immense challenges. From childhood, his father instilled in him the belief that success was not a choice, but an obligation. "Respect is not asked for, Edward," Richard would often say. "It is earned through victory." Edward was educated in private schools, learning the intricacies of finance and business strategy, while his peers played video games. His father's figure heavily influenced him, imparting the belief that power and dominance were fundamental to thriving in the business world. Upon graduating from Oxford, Edward was already laying the foundations of his own venture. By the age of 20, Edward established Sterling Tech Solutions, a startup specializing in artificial intelligence and data protection. Thanks to his sharp intuition and relentless work ethic, he soon achieved significant success. By the time he turned 30, his company was valued at over £200 million, and Edward had positioned himself as a prominent figure in the business landscape. He drove luxury cars, resided in a penthouse with breathtaking views of Hyde Park, and was always in the company of influential individuals. His identity was shaped by success, which brought with it certain consequences. At a cafe near his office, Edward met Isabella Thompson. She was an architecture student, sketching in a notebook when he first spotted her. There was something refreshing about her. His wealth and social standing meant nothing to her. She was grounded and authentic. For the first time in a long time, Edward felt truly seen by someone, not just his achievements. They began dating, and Isabella's arrival brought harmony to his chaotic routine. She made him laugh, encouraged him to pause from work, and made him see that life was more than just figures and business transactions. After a year together, Edward proposed. When Isabella nodded without hesitation, everything took an unexpected turn as she revealed she was expecting a baby. Edward had meticulously planned his future. A family didn't fit into his 5-year company growth projection. He decided he wasn't ready for fatherhood, believing his work demanded too much of him. He began extending his work hours, missing commitments like dinners and antenatal appointments. Isabella tried to reach out, but Edward remained distant. He told himself it was just a temporary situation, confident he would reap rewards once the company prospered. However, Isabella decided to confront him one evening. With tears in her eyes, she expressed, "Edward, you're absent. We need you." Edward dismissed the idea indifferently, stating, "I can't do this. I'm not ready to be a father." Isabella watched him intently for a long time before leaving. Edward convinced himself it was for the best, that focusing on his career would secure their future. Yet, deep down, he knew he was deceiving himself. After that night, he never saw Isabella again. Immersed in his work, he convinced himself he had made the right choice. However, standing in the ballroom, looking at the boy with his own eyes, Edward clearly understood what he had lost. Before we delve deeper into this impactful story of second chances and reconciliation, we highly recommend you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss stories like this, emotional experiences that make us reflect on what truly matters in life. Edward struggled to breathe. His heart pounded so intensely in his chest that he could barely hear the soft conversations around him. He kept his gaze fixed on the little boy standing next to Isabella, holding her hand and observing the entire room with interest. The resemblance was undeniable. Identical deep blue eyes, the same curve of his forehead, even the way the little one tilted his head slightly when thinking. It was like looking at a younger version of himself. He took a hesitant step forward, yet his feet felt rooted to the floor. Isabella's thoughts flooded his mind. Her joyful expression, her laughter, the tenderness of her touch. In that instant, he relived the moment he last saw her. Tears in her eyes, as he confessed he wasn't ready to be a father. Edward found himself needing to move through the room, weaving past groups of people, until he stopped a short distance from her. As she turned her head, Isabella saw him, and her expression instantly changed. She stiffened, automatically squeezing the boy's hand. "Isabella," Edward whispered, barely audible. Isabella's gaze hardened. "Edward." She swallowed determinedly and looked down at the little boy. The boy watched with obvious interest. Edward inquired, his voice trembling, "Who is he?" Isabella's jaw tightened. "Oh, Gabriel!" Edward's heart raced. "He's 5 years old," Isabella replied sharply when asked for his age. A shiver ran through Edward. 5 years. Everything aligned perfectly. He felt a crushing sensation in his chest. He looked at the boy again, his eyes pleading. "Is he?" Isabella's expression was severe. "Edward," she said in a low, forceful tone. "That's an inappropriate question. You left, didn't you? You didn't care." "You knew?" Isabella murmured, her cheeks flushed with fury. "I begged you to listen. I tried to tell you, but you were too busy closing deals and expanding your empire to pay attention." Edward clenched his teeth. She was right. His excessive ambition had blinded him, isolating him completely. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Edward whispered. "But Gabriel is my son. I have a right to know." Isabella's eyes blazed. "Really?" she repeated sadly. "Where were you when your son took his first steps? During those nights of anguish and crying from nightmares, Andrew was always there to support me. Andrew taught him how to ride a bike. Andrew accompanied his friend to school plays and stayed awake by his side when he was ill." Edward's stomach churned at the mention of Andrew. He was familiar with the name. Last year, a pediatric surgeon by that name had been featured on the front page of a medical journal. The man was practically revered. Isabella watched Gabriel kicking the football across the lawn, and in that moment, her eyes reflected a subtle calm. In a soft voice, she affirmed, "Don't be mistaken, Edward. His father is Andrew." Sebastian felt a sharp pang in his chest. He had squandered a considerable amount of time. Isabella hesitated, then asked, "Does he know about my existence?" "Never," Edward inhaled sharply. He looked at Gabriel and asked if he thought he had the right to know the truth. Isabella's jaw hardened. "You actually left?" Edward's voice fractured. "I didn't know that information, but now I do, and I want to fix it." Isabella shook her head. "It's not as simple as it seems." Edward took a step forward. "Allow me the chance to be part of his life. Please." Isabella's eyes gleamed with emotion. For an instant, she seemed to hesitate, until Gabriel shouted from the other end of the park, "Mummy, look!" Seeing Gabriel score a goal, Isabella's expression softened. A gentle smile appeared on her face as she waved. Edward's heart ached. Isabella let out a sigh before saying, "I can't commit to anything right now." She concluded, "However, perhaps you could consider attending his football match next Saturday." Edward's eyes widened. "Really?" he confirmed, nodding. "It's just a match, nothing more." Cautious hope swelled in Edward's chest. Although it wasn't much, it was a start. "Thank you so much," he whispered. Isabella turned to walk away. However, Edward called out to her, "Isabella, wait!" She looked over her shoulder, and Edward affirmed that this time he wouldn't disappear. He promised solemnly. After a long moment, Isabella scrutinized the situation before nodding slightly. Then she walked to Gabriel and took his hand. Edward watched them walk away. After a long time, he felt a stirring within him, a spark of optimism. Perhaps he hadn't completely lost everything after all. What will Edward do to prove he's serious about being a father? And what's the most surprising small gesture that changed a relationship in your life? Share your stories below. Edward fidgeted in the crowded stands of the local football pitch as the setting sun cast long shadows across the field. His heart pounded in his chest as his eyes scanned the pitch for Gabriel. He had never been to one of Gabriel's matches before. After their conversation in the park, Isabella had reluctantly agreed to let him come. Edward arrived early to ensure a clear view of the game. He sat alone, holding a disposable coffee cup that had long since gone cold. It was then that he spotted him. On the pitch, Gabriel wore a red jersey, his blonde hair falling across his forehead in the intense sunlight. Smaller than his teammates, he showed determination as he adjusted the hem of his shorts. Edward felt his chest stir as Gabriel's gaze drifted towards the sidelines. For a fleeting instant, their eyes met. Gabriel blinked with interest before returning his attention to the game. Edward's breath caught. The simple act of eye contact unleashed an intense wave of feelings within him. His son had seen him and recognized him immediately. Although it wasn't much, to Edward, it was priceless. Just before the match began, a figure sat down beside him on the bench. Edward's jaw tightened as he saw Andrew Davies sit down, calmly, casually, wearing a button-down shirt with rolled-up sleeves. Before focusing on the pitch, Andrew politely nodded to Edward. "Didn't expect to see you here," Andrew said casually. Edward stiffened. "I said I intended to come." A faint smile played on Andrew's lips. "Isabella told me." He glanced at Edward. "Gabriel has no idea who you are." Edward gripped the coffee cup tightly in his hands. "I'm working on that." Andrew's gaze remained steady. "You have a long way to go." Edward's teeth clenched. He hated how comfortable Andrew seemed, as if he belonged there. Andrew wasn't just watching Gabriel's game. He was part of Gabriel's daily life. Suddenly, Andrew stood up and clapped, cheering Gabriel on with a shout of encouragement. Just as Gabriel kicked the ball towards the goal, Edward turned his head to the pitch. The goalkeeper dove. However, the ball barely grazed his fingers before rolling into the net. The applause from the small crowd resonated enthusiastically. A joyful expression spread across Gabriel's face. He looked towards the stands, searching for something. Edward stood up, meeting Gabriel's gaze. However, Gabriel's eyes first fixated on Andrew. Gabriel ran towards the stands, excitedly calling for his father. Edward felt a sharp pain in his chest as Gabriel ran to Andrew and hugged him. Effortlessly, Andrew lifted Gabriel, who clung tightly to his neck, laughing. Edward found himself suddenly immobile. His hands trembled. With a wide smile, Gabriel asked, "Did you see that?" With a smile, Andrew affirmed, "Of course, mate." Before putting him down, he ruffled Gabriel's hair. Gabriel smiled proudly, saying, "You're a natural." Edward calmly cleared his throat. He forced a smile. "Gabriel, you played very well." The joyful expression on Gabriel's face faded slightly as he turned to Edward. He hesitated, looking at Andrew for support. In a low tone, Gabriel expressed his thanks. Edward's heart clenched. For so long he had yearned for this moment, to hear his son's words. However, the hesitation in Gabriel's voice and his cautious tone made it clear how far he was from earning Gabriel's true trust. Andrew's gaze sharpened as he placed a protective hand on Gabriel's shoulder. Andrew calmly mentioned that Isabella was probably waiting for them. Edward's eyes darkened. "I'd like to talk to him. Just a minute." Andrew's politeness remained intact. However, his gaze turned icy. "It's not your place, is it?" Edward's jaw tightened. "This boy is my son." Andrew's expression hardened. "Is he really? From my perspective, I'm the one raising him." Edward's fists clenched. He took a step towards Andrew. Andrew quietly remarked that Edward had already had his moment to act. "You made your choice many years ago." Edward felt his chest suddenly swell and contract. He looked at Gabriel, who was impatiently pulling on Andrew's hand, ready to leave. Gabriel quietly said goodbye before leaving with Andrew. Edward watched them walk away, his throat burning. The crowd's applause faded into a distant murmur. Some parents watched the exchange with barely concealed interest. Edward's ears burned as a couple of people whispered around him. One woman whispered to another parent, "Is that the fellow? I thought he was such a brilliant CEO. So, he lost everything a while ago, didn't he?" Edward's fists clenched. He could feel their criticisms like knives on his skin. They weren't wrong. He had lost everything, and now even his own son seemed to be slipping through his fingers. Isabella appeared at the edge of the pitch, waving to Gabriel and Andrew. With open arms, Gabriel quickly ran to her. Hugging him, she brushed his hair back and gave him a warm smile. A lump formed in Edward's throat. That life, that family, they were meant for him. Andrew approached Isabella and kissed her cheek. He smiled. They seemed to be in perfect harmony, as if destined to be together. Edward felt like an outsider. He didn't belong there. He had traded his life for boardroom meetings and business dealings. Now, Andrew was enjoying the life he had left behind. He turned and walked towards the car park. His heart pounded with fury and regret. His fingers ached to strike something, anything, to release the irritation building within him. As he neared his car, he heard footsteps behind him. Isabella's voice called out, "I saw you." Edward spun around. A few feet away, she stood, arms crossed over her chest. "I'll keep my word," Edward said in a low voice. Isabella's eyes softened. "It will take more than simply showing up to fix this." Edward's expression darkened. "Andrew has no right to lecture me on fatherhood." Isabella's eyebrows rose in surprise. Andrew has raised Gabriel since he was a baby. He's been present for every important moment. Edward replied in a low, harsh voice that he wasn't trying to replace him. But I can be there now. I just want to connect with my son. Isabella pursed her lips. Stop talking about Andrew like that. Focus on Gabriel. Edward looked intently into her eyes and asked, Forgive me. Isabella's eyes were filled with emotion, sparkling. Show consistency in your actions. Make a personal introduction and take responsibility for your own decisions instead of blaming others. Edward's jaw tightened. Isabella took a deep breath before stating, I have to go. She turned and walked towards Andrew and Gabriel, who were waiting by the car. As they walked away, Gabriel smiled at Andrew. Before setting off, Andrew looked at Edward indifferently. Edward remained in the car park, hands in his pockets. His chest ached. Isabella's sincere words deeply affected him. He had lost the opportunity to be a father. Now, he faced the challenge of winning it back. Edward remained alone in his car, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles whitened. He relived the confrontation with Andrew in his mind, which caused his heart to pound erratically, repeatedly, like a scratched record. Despite knowing it would be a challenge, witnessing Gabriel's quick bond with Andrew affected him in an unexpectedly devastating way. Andrew had challenged him, and the most painful part was that Andrew hadn't done anything wrong. Edward leaned back in the seat, letting his eyelids fall as he felt the weight of failure pressing on his chest. Throughout his entire life, his focus had been on triumph, closing deals, winning contracts, achieving recognition. However, this wasn't a boardroom. He couldn't win Gabriel's heart through negotiation. It wasn't possible to reverse so many years of separation with a simple gesture of reconciliation and a few words of remorse. His phone rang on the passenger seat. He hesitated before looking at the screen. It was Isabella. Gabriel's school has a special father-son activity this Friday. If you really want to find out, see where it is. Edward's heart began to beat faster. Before drafting a reply, his fingers hovered over the screen. I'll be there. Friday couldn't come fast enough. That day, Edward left work with determination not to mess things up. He had even bought Gabriel a small gift, a Spider-Man figurine. Upon arriving at the school gymnasium, he nervously clutched the toy after Isabella had mentioned Gabriel was passionate about superheroes. The room was buzzing with activity. Children and their parents were in different areas, collaborating on art creations, playing games, and chatting. Edward spotted Isabella standing by a table, watching Gabriel as he painted with a small group. Edward hesitated before approaching them. His heart pounded intensely. He had the chance to show Gabriel his commitment. When Edward approached, Gabriel looked up. Edward's eyes narrowed slightly, and he forced a smile. "Hello, Gabriel," Edward greeted, kneeling to meet his gaze. He offered him the toy. "I hear you're a big Spider-Man fan." Gabriel looked at Isabella for reassurance before calmly extending his hand to take the toy. After examining it carefully, Gabriel quietly thanked Edward. Edward's chest swelled. Although it wasn't much, it was something. Edward suggested playing a game, gesturing towards the basketball hoop at the far end of the gym. Gabriel hesitated, looking at Isabella. She made an encouraging gesture. "Okay," Gabriel whispered. With his heart pounding, Edward followed his son towards the hoop. He watched Gabriel take a basketball and try to shoot. However, the ball barely grazed the rim. Gabriel's face fell. Edward offered his assistance. Positioning himself behind Gabriel, showing him how to hold his hands, Edward gently advised him, "Bend your knees a little, aim, and then release." When Gabriel threw the ball, it bounced off the backboard and went through the hoop. A look of pure joy lit up Gabriel's face as he exclaimed, "I did it!" Edward's smile widened. Excellent work, mate. Gabriel took the ball again and shot it by himself. It went in. With a smile, Gabriel turned back. Edward saw something in his son's eyes he had never witnessed before. Trust. Just as Edward was beginning to relax, Andrew's voice sounded across the room. Found you. Edward's joyful expression vanished. Andrew approached them with an impassive face, though his eyes were intense. He placed his hand on Gabriel's shoulder. Hello, champ, Andrew said. Look at the gift Edward gave me. Gabriel held up the Spider-Man toy. A lump formed in Edward's stomach. Andrew's smile was soft. All right, why don't you join the crafts activity at the table? We're making superhero masks. Gabriel hesitated, looking at Edward with uncertainty, unsure which man to choose. Go on, Edward said quickly. Gabriel smiled and quickly headed to the table. Andrew remained still, his gaze fixed on Edward. I see you're trying hard, Andrew said in a low voice. Edward frowned. What do you mean? Andrew's jaw tightened. This isn't a competition, Edward. Edward felt his chest tighten. He's my son. Andrew's eyes sharpened. You didn't realize that until now? Edward's fists clenched. He lowered his voice to a dangerous level. I have every right to be part of his life. Andrew's expression turned grim. Where was that insight 5 years ago? Edward opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The truth hit him like a sharp blade. He hadn't been there. You're right, Andrew. I wasn't. Andrew's gaze held a quiet firmness. It's not the time to try and change the past. I'm not trying to change anything, Edward said, trying to set things right. A faint, mirthless smile touched Andrew's lips. Good luck with that. Andrew turned and walked towards Gabriel. As Edward stood there, his chest rising and falling rapidly. Edward slumped heavily onto the nearest chair, hands tangled in his hair. The hum of the room enveloped him. Yet everything dissolved into static. He had never felt so helpless. What will Isabella do about this escalating tension between Edward and Andrew? What's the most challenging co-parenting situation you've ever heard of, and how was it resolved? Share your thoughts below. Suddenly, Isabella appeared beside him. She sat down gently, her eyes calm yet cautious. You did well, Isabella said softly. Edward looked up, his throat tight. Do you really think so? Isabella offered a faint smile. Gabriel doesn't know about your past. That's a huge step forward. Edward felt a sharp pain as his chest swelled. Touching his face with his hands, he expressed, I feel like I'm failing. Isabella's gaze softened. You're not. However, this can't be fixed overnight. Edward let out a slow sigh. What if he never sees me as his father? Isabella's expression grew serious. Andrew has supported Gabriel since the beginning. You can't change that. Gabriel doesn't need you to compete with Andrew. He needs you to be present and to stay. Edward's eyes sharpened. I'm not going anywhere. Isabella scrutinized him before nodding her approval. Go on. Try. She stood and walked towards Gabriel and Andrew. As Andrew helped Gabriel cut out a superhero mask, the latter couldn't stop laughing. Isabella leaned down to kiss Gabriel's forehead. Andrew smiled. Edward remained in his seat, his heart aching with melancholy. Though it wasn't his place, jealousy gnawed at him incessantly. He had lost so much. Now, he needed to make the most of every moment. Edward calmly stood up, adjusting his jacket. His attention was drawn to Gabriel, who shyly waved at him. Edward's chest ached deeply as his heart thumped with anguish. He returned the wave with a soft smile. Although it wasn't much, it was a beginning. If you've made it this far with the story, please take a moment to like the video. It significantly helps more people discover these impactful narratives. I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever felt the need to restore a relationship? Share your thoughts in the comments section. I read every one. and your experience might inspire someone else going through a similar situation. Don't forget that. If this story moved you, click the like button and share the video with someone who might benefit from hearing it. Your support has a greater impact than you imagine. If you're new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications to stay updated on our next emotional story. Many more inspiring journeys await us in the near future. Thank you for your presence, and remember that it's always possible to recover, reconnect, and choose love. Edward stood outside Isabella's house, holding a small gift in his hand. His chest tight with anxiety, he felt his heart pound loudly as he knocked on the door. 2 weeks had passed since the school event, and he could sense subtle changes in the atmosphere. It was enough for Edward to feel he was no longer entirely excluded. Isabella had sent him a text message, casually mentioning Gabriel's upcoming 6th birthday. Although she hadn't directly invited him, by mentioning it, Edward understood her unspoken meaning. The door opened, and Isabella stood there, her expression carefully neutral, wearing a soft blue jumper, her hair pulled back from her face. "Hello?" Edward greeted nervously. Isabella's gaze drifted to the gift bag. Edward cleared his throat. "You didn't have to bring anything, but I wanted to." "Is he home?" Isabella hesitated before stepping aside. "Come in." Edward entered the home and immediately sensed its cozy atmosphere. Family photos lined the walls. Gabriel enjoying a day at the beach. Gabriel holding an award at a school event. Gabriel riding on Andrew's shoulders during a summer fete. A lump formed in Edward's throat. He had missed absolutely everything. Hearing the sound of tiny feet running in the hallway, he turned. Gabriel appeared at the end of the corridor, dressed in a superhero cape and brandishing a toy sword. "Hey, mate," Edward said softly. Gabriel slowed, looking to Isabella for reassurance. "Look who's come to visit," Isabella said gently. Cautiously, Gabriel approached, his attention fixed on the gift bag Edward held. Edward, kneeling down to Gabriel's level, said, "I've brought something for you." He handed the boy the bag. Carefully, Gabriel opened the box. His eyes widened as he pulled out a brand new Captain America shield. "Wow!" Gabriel exclaimed, his face beaming. Instantly, he strapped the shield to his arm and raised his plastic sword. "I am Captain America!" His son's excitement made Edward's heart pound. "You look ready to change the world, Captain!" Gabriel ran quickly towards the living room and launched himself onto the sofa. Edward stood up, a smile on his face. His gaze met Isabella's. For the first time, her face showed a softer expression. She asked if he wanted to stay a while longer. Edward's eyes widened. "Of course, I'd love to." Isabella gestured towards the living room. "Go on then." Edward joined Gabriel in the room and settled onto the floor beside him. "We need to stop the villains," Gabriel said, offering a toy shield and sword. With a smile, Edward affirmed he was ready. Over the next hour, Edward played with Gabriel, helping him build a fort out of sofa cushions and pillows. As they defeated a fictitious enemy, Gabriel's face shone with pure joy. The delightful sound of his son's laughter filled the room, and in that moment, Edward felt a comforting calm he hadn't experienced in a long time. Isabella stood nearby, watching them with a thoughtful expression. Edward's gaze caught hers, and she offered a subtle smile. After a while, Gabriel yawned and leaned against Edward's side. Edward's breath hitched as he felt Gabriel's head rest on his arm. Carefully, Edward put his arm around Gabriel's tiny body. Gabriel, sleepy, murmured, "Daddy!" Edward's body completely stiffened. Isabella froze, meeting his gaze. Edward's throat tightened. Gabriel looked up at him with half-closed eyes. "My daddy." Edward's eyes burned with emotion. He looked to Isabella for direction. Isabella's face held a dual expression, a mix of surprise and doubt. In a soft voice, she said, "Yes, you can call him that." Edward felt a sharp pang in his chest. "Gabriel?" "Yes?" Just then, before he could add anything else, the front door opened. Andrew entered, carrying a shopping bag. Upon seeing Edward on the floor with Gabriel leaning against him, he narrowed his eyes. "Daddy!" Gabriel immediately piped up. "Look at the gift Edward gave me." Andrew's smile was strained. "How wonderful, mate." He placed the shopping bag on the counter before approaching them. Edward stood up, rigid, feeling Andrew's gaze on him. Andrew coolly expressed his surprise at Edward's presence. Edward, composed, explained he had been invited by Isabella. Andrew gritted his teeth. "Really?" Isabella saw his eyes darken. Andrew quickly interrupted her, explaining he was only surprised. His attention shifted back to Edward. "This isn't really your scene, is it?" Edward's posture straightened instantly. "I'm trying to connect with my son." Andrew frowned. "You've been absent for 6 years. It's not realistic to just walk back into someone's past and pretend nothing happened." Edward calmly replied that he didn't expect that. Andrew stepped closer. "Are you sure?" he whispered. "Because it looks a lot like that." Isabella stepped between them. "That's enough," she stated firmly. Andrew gritted his teeth and backed away. He looked at Edward. Gabriel interrupted the tense atmosphere with his voice. "Daddy, can Edward have dinner with us?" Edward's breath hitched. Isabella's expression was calm, while Andrew's darkened. Isabella hesitated before speaking. "Perhaps another time." Edward felt a pang in his chest, though he forced a smile. "All right, mate. We'll get going soon." Gabriel shrugged. "Okay." Edward ruffled his hair. He asked if next time he'd show him superhero tricks. With a smile, Gabriel exclaimed, "Of course." Edward turned towards the entrance. Isabella accompanied Edward to the door. "Thank you," Edward said softly. Isabella's gaze softened. "He's starting to trust you." Edward felt hope cautiously take root in his chest. "I'll stay," he stated firmly. "I won't leave." Isabella looked at him briefly before nodding. "I hope you mean it." Edward left and headed towards his car, his heart pounding. That night, he wasn't sure what had transformed him, but he sensed it was the beginning of something genuine. Edward felt a different sensation when he was with Gabriel, a sense of hope he hadn't felt before. What do you think is the biggest hurdle Edward still faces in building a true relationship with Gabriel? How would you define fatherhood in a situation like this, where a new figure has already stepped in? Share your thoughts below. Edward couldn't get that moment out of his mind. "My daddy." That's what Gabriel had called him. Over and over, the word echoed in Edward's mind. It wasn't just a fleeting mistake. It had meaning. Gabriel had begun to see him as something more than just a guest. With just one word, Edward saw a door open that he thought was sealed forever. However, it also terrified him, as it implied the possibility of losing it just as quickly. In the weeks that followed, Edward began to be consistently present. Football sessions, school activities, even casual moments in the park. He was there. He didn't exert too much pressure. He carefully mirrored Isabella's actions, trying not to overstep. Gradually, Gabriel began to be more receptive towards him. That Saturday afternoon, Edward sat on a park bench watching Gabriel play. Isabella sat beside him, holding a cup of coffee. Gabriel laughed as he kicked the football, chasing it towards the goal. "He's really brilliant," Edward praised. Isabella smiled. "Andrew's been giving him lessons." At the mention of Andrew, Edward felt a familiar pang in his chest, though he tried to remain composed. "Does he ever mention me?" Edward asked quietly. He couldn't afford to be ignored. Isabella hesitated before replying. "Sometimes. He asks why you weren't around when he was little, I tell him you didn't know, that you weren't ready. Edward gritted his teeth. It's the truth, he affirmed, but that doesn't make it right. Isabella's expression softened. No, it doesn't. Breathless and beaming, Gabriel rushed over to them. Did you see that? Of course! Edward stood up with a smile. He knelt and offered a high five. Gabriel enthusiastically slapped his hand. With a hopeful look, Gabriel asked if they could get ice cream. Isabella hesitated. We were planning to meet Andrew for dinner. Gabriel's face fell slightly. He looked at Edward and suggested that he could join them too. Edward's eyes widened. He looked at Isabella for approval. Isabella hesitated, then sighed. All right, but you explain it to Andrew. Edward's heart ached with intense pain. This was significant. 15 minutes later, they arrived at a small Italian restaurant. Andrew was already seated at a table. Upon seeing Edward behind Isabella and Gabriel, his eyebrows raised slightly. Evening, Andrew greeted cautiously. Gabriel quickly took the seat next to Andrew and exclaimed enthusiastically, Edward's joining us! Andrew's smile didn't reach his eyes. Really? Isabella settled into the chair opposite Andrew. Edward hesitated before taking a seat. The tension at the table was palpable. Gabriel announced that Edward had given him a Captain America shield. Did you thank him? Andrew calmly responded. Yes. Gabriel smiled at Edward. A faint smile touched Edward's lips. He looked at Andrew, expecting opposition. However, Andrew's expression remained impassive. When the waiter approached, they ordered their food. Gabriel chatted excitedly about his latest football practice, alternating between Andrew and Edward as he shared the details. Edward watched with a heavy heart, a strange mix of joy and discomfort. He was in, but not completely. Despite being present in Gabriel's life, Andrew remained the primary figure, which challenged Edward to find a way to navigate the situation. When the food arrived, Gabriel's spaghetti was steaming hot. Andrew frowned and slid the plate towards Edward. Could you blow on it? Edward briefly hesitated before taking the utensil and gently blowing on the plate of pasta. Gabriel watched him intently, his face serious. Edward asked if it was better. With a smile, Gabriel nodded. Edward's chest swelled with emotion. Isabella watched them intently from the opposite side of the table, her gaze calm and thoughtful. Andrew put down his utensil. Edward tensed, hearing the sound. What does this mean? Andrew leaned back in his chair. He wants you here. His interest in being part of his life is evident. It's not that he's trying. Edward calmly responded. I'm doing it. Andrew's eyes darkened. He stated, It's not that easy. Edward gritted his teeth. I won't disappear. Andrew's gaze sharpened. I've been looking after him for 6 years, Edward. That's not something that changes overnight. Edward whispered that he wasn't trying to make him forget. He just wanted to connect with his son. Andrew scrutinized him for a moment. Then his expression softened, though only slightly. Edward frowned in concern. Andrew nodded affirmatively. If you're committed to this, you'll have to work to earn it. Gabriel isn't a prize. He's a child. Don't hurt him. Edward felt a lump in his throat and replied firmly, I won't. Andrew held his gaze for an instant before nodding slightly and returning his attention to his food. Edward's shoulders relaxed. He felt for the first time that Andrew wasn't blocking his progress, but rather walking beside him. After dinner, they decided to go out and enjoy the night breeze. Gabriel grabbed Edward's hand and asked if they could visit the park the next day. Edward smiled. He expressed his confidence that they could make it work. Gabriel's smile widened. Before letting go, he squeezed Edward's hand and rushed towards Isabella. Andrew remained standing next to Edward, watching them. After a moment, he spoke. You're making more progress than I expected, Andrew commented in a low voice. Edward raised an eyebrow. Was that a compliment? Andrew offered a faint smile. Don't make it a habit. Edward chuckled subtly. Under the streetlights, he saw Gabriel and Isabella sharing laughter. His heart swelled with happiness. Listen, Andrew, Edward said in a more solemn tone. Andrew looked up quickly. Thank you for being there when I wasn't. Andrew's expression softened. You still have much to prove. Edward nodded affirmatively. I'm aware. Before heading towards Isabella and Gabriel, Andrew gave a vigorous nod. Following Gabriel slowly, Edward felt a weight lift from his chest as his friend turned and smiled at him. Although it wasn't perfect, it represented progress. That was all Edward needed. This shared family meal is a huge step. What do you think the next milestone for Edward and Gabrielle will be? And how do you navigate complex family dynamics with new and old relationships? Share your strategies below. Edward stood at the edge of the football pitch, hands on his hips, watching Gabriel warm up with his team. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grass. A crisp autumn breeze carried the distant murmur of parents chatting and children laughing. It was Gabriel's first official match, and Edward wouldn't have missed it for anything. After leaving the office early, he had faced congested traffic and missed an important work call. None of that mattered. His presence here was what counted. Hello, Edward? He turned towards the familiar voice. Isabella stood by the sidelines, gesturing for him to approach. She wore a gray jumper and dark jeans, her brown hair tied back in a casual ponytail. Andrew stood beside her, arms crossed over his chest. Edward hesitated briefly before approaching. You made it, Isabella said with a smiling expression. I wouldn't miss it, Edward affirmed, looking intently at Gabriel. Andrew briefly nodded. He's been talking about this game all week. Edward offered a faint smile. He confirmed he was aware that Gabriel had been practicing his penalty kicks. Andrew's gaze rested on Edward. No emotion was reflected in his face, but rather a serene acceptance. Calmly, Andrew uncrossed his arms. All right, let's see if it works. Isabella smiled during the conversation, while Edward's eyes remained fixed on Gabriel. The boy was on the field, intently watching the crowd with wide, expectant eyes. Upon seeing Edward, Gabriel's face lit up. He raised his hand in a wave. Edward's chest swelled. He smiled and waved back. He seems ready, Isabella whispered. As he watched Gabriel adjust his jersey and head towards his position on the field, Edward's breath caught. At the referee's whistle, the game began. The opposing team proved competent, fast, and organized. Early in the match, they had already scored a goal. Gabriel's team tried their best to regain control, but they found it difficult to keep up. As Gabriel tried to block a pass, Edward's heart pounded intensely. He was almost there, but at the last moment, the other player blocked his path. Go on, mate, Edward whispered. Isabella and Andrew stood nearby, both showing signs of nervousness. In a serene and determined voice, Andrew shouted words of encouragement. Isabella clasped her hands and fixed her gaze on the field. Edward felt his heart was about to burst. With only 5 minutes left in the game, Gabriel's team was awarded a penalty. Edward's heart began to pound faster. Gabriel's up, Isabella murmured. Edward's eyes widened as he watched Gabriel walk forward. The referee handed him the ball. Gabriel's teammates patted him on the back, whispering words of encouragement. Edward felt his chest tighten with tension. As Gabriel positioned the ball, uncertainty showed in his eyes. Edward quietly expressed his doubt. Is he ready? Andrew's gaze remained resolute. Yes, he is. Edward's fists clenched as Gabriel inhaled deeply and took a step back. An absolute silence fell over the spectators. The goalkeeper crouched, ready to dive. Leaning forward, Edward felt his heart pounding intensely. Running quickly towards the ball, Gabriel kicked it powerfully. The ball soared through the air, heading towards the left corner of the goal. The goalkeeper dove. The ball hit the post. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Gabriel's shoulders sagged in disappointment as the ball rolled out of bounds. Edward's heart filled with sadness. Gabriel's hands rested at his sides, motionless on the field, his face pale and lost. Edward moved his legs without consciously processing his action. Before the referee could stop him, he had already crossed half the field. He reached Gabriel just as the boy's chin began to tremble. Tears welled in Gabriel's eyes. "I messed up," he murmured. Edward knelt, gently gripping Gabriel's shoulders. "Look at me," Edward whispered, imploring him. Reluctantly, Gabriel looked up. Edward, calmly and determinedly, said, "You didn't mess up. That was an excellent shot." Gabriel's face crumpled in concern. "But I didn't score." "That's right," Edward replied. "But you tried. That's what matters." Gabriel's lips began to tremble. Edward wiped a tear from his cheek with his hand and expressed, "I'm so proud of you, Gabriel. Can you hear me? I'm so proud of you." Gabriel's eyes widened slightly. Edward smiled. "Yes." Sitting on the bench, Edward felt the intensity of the crowd's stares. The referee was approaching, determined to ask him to leave the field. Edward didn't care at all. His only concern was the boy in front of him. Gabriel clutched Edward's jacket tightly. Gradually, the boy leaned forward and hugged Edward, wrapping his arms around his neck. Edward felt a powerful squeeze in his chest as he hugged Gabriel tightly, burying his face in Gabriel's hair. He could feel Isabella and Andrew's gaze from the sidelines, but this time, he didn't feel out of place. "Come on, mate," Edward whispered encouragingly. He felt a sense of fullness. "Let's finish the game." Gabriel calmed, wiping his tears. Edward ruffled his hair and stood up, guiding him back towards his teammates. As he left the field, Edward received a cautious glance from the referee. Edward simply smiled and raised his hands. Isabella and Andrew waited at the edge of the field. "What audacity!" Andrew exclaimed sternly. Edward offered a faint smile. "I thought it was the right decision." Andrew's mouth twisted. It was. Isabella's eyes gleamed with emotion. "I appreciate your gesture." Seeing Gabriel, Edward's expression softened. The boy was back in his place, calm and confident. "I didn't really do anything," Edward expressed. Isabella shook her head. "You came back." Edward felt a lump in his throat, crossed his arms, and watched the sound of the final whistle. Despite Gabriel's team's loss, the youngsters cheered each other on regardless. A smile appeared on Gabriel's face as he was surrounded by his teammates, receiving pats on the back and a collective hug. After the match, Gabriel rushed quickly towards the stands where Edward, Isabella, and Andrew were waiting. Breathless, Gabriel excitedly asked them, "Did you see it?" Edward leaned down. "I saw you. You were amazing." A smile appeared on Gabriel's face. After a brief hesitation, he finally extended his arm towards Edward. Edward's heart stopped. Gently and calmly, he tenderly held Gabriel's small hand. Gabriel turned to Andrew and asked if he had seen it too. Andrew offered a smile. "I saw you, champion. You were brilliant." A smile appeared on Gabriel's face. He looked at Andrew and Edward. This time, Edward felt different, no longer needing to compete for Gabriel's affection. As she watched them, Isabella smiled. "I saw you." Then she looked at Edward. Edward offered a faint smile. "I think I finally made it this time." Andrew's gaze rested on Gabriel. After that, he nodded in agreement. "All right," he said. "See you later, lads." Edward felt his chest swell with emotion as he felt Gabriel encourage him. "Come on, Daddy." Edward's pupils gleamed with intensity. A soft smile lit up his face as he walked Gabriel to the car park, feeling a sense of relief in his heart he hadn't felt in a long time. This time, he wasn't just trying to get to know his son. He was embracing the ways of a father. What profound impact do you think this shared moment on the football pitch will have on Edward, Gabriel, and their unconventional family? What's the most impactful lesson you've learned about the true meaning of winning and losing in life? Share your reflections below. Edward sat at the corner table of the pizzeria, his arm resting on the back of his chair, watching Gabriel happily devour his second slice of pepperoni pizza. Gabriel, beaming with pride over his performance in the match despite the loss, stretched the cheese between his mouth and the slice. Isabella sat next to Gabriel, calm, enjoying her soft drink. The warmth of the moment settled in Edward's heart, a pleasant sense of connection he hadn't experienced in a long time. "Fancy more food?" Edward offered kindly. Gabriel shook his head, his cheeks smeared with pizza. "Saving room for the ice cream sundae," he mumbled, mouth full of cheese. Edward chuckled. "Excellent strategy." A smile appeared on Isabella's face. Andrew always buys him one after every match. At the mention of Andrew, Edward barely noticed a slight hesitation in her smile, though he managed to control his emotions. He couldn't let comparisons trap him anymore. It wasn't about Andrew. It was about Gabriel. Gabriel, eyes wide, asked if he could have chocolate sauce and sprinkles. Edward's heart clenched at the innocent question. "Of course!" With a smile, Gabriel rested his head on Edward's arm. Edward stiffened for a brief moment before relaxing. Slowly, he raised his hand and placed it on Gabriel's head, gently stroking his hair. Silently, Isabella watched the moment. Edward looked at her and sensed the tenderness she reflected. "You're getting really good at this," she commented softly. Edward's lips curved into a smile. "I'm learning from the best." Isabella raised an eyebrow. Gabriel's smile widened. "You are too." Suddenly, with a joyful expression, Gabriel sat up and asked if they could visit the park the next day. "Just the two of us?" Edward's breath hitched. Gabriel's eyes sparkled with anticipation. Edward cautiously asked if he was sure. Gabriel nodded affirmatively. "Maybe you could help me improve my kicking technique." Edward swallowed the tightness in his throat. "It would be my pleasure." With a smile, Gabriel returned to his delicious pizza. As he watched the simplicity and spontaneity of the situation, Edward felt a poignant ache in his chest. Isabella's face reflected tenderness. "It's the first time he's asked to spend time alone with you," she whispered. Edward's throat burned. He had to control his voice to keep it steady. "I know." A shadow fell across the table, causing Edward to look up and see Andrew standing before him. "Evening, Andrew," he greeted. Andrew's gaze shifted from Gabriel to Edward. A joyful expression appeared on Gabriel's face as he exclaimed, "Daddy!" Andrew watched Gabriel's stance next to Edward, noticing a change in his facial expression. For a fleeting instant, Edward felt a pang in his chest. Andrew calmly greeted him. "Evening, champ," he said. He moved subtly to a private area with Isabella. Gabriel announced his intention to go for ice cream. Andrew smiled joyfully and exclaimed, "How wonderful!" Isabella's eyes met Edward's. "Would you mind if I joined your group?" Edward's shoulders stiffened. Before he could respond, Gabriel spoke. Enthusiastically, he exclaimed, "Of course." There was uncertainty in Edward. He had envisioned this situation, sitting with Andrew and Isabella at the table, enjoying Gabriel's presence together. However, he hadn't expected it to be so complex. Andrew's gaze remained resolute as he watched Edward. There was no animosity, only a quiet observation. Edward cleared his throat. "Of course." Andrew nodded and leaned back. A waitress approached and took their drink order. Suddenly, Gabriel exclaimed, addressing Andrew. "Daddy!" "Did you see my kick?" Andrew replied with a faint smile. "I saw it. You almost hit her." Gabriel's joyful expression dimmed a little. "I missed," he exclaimed. "That's right," Andrew replied, "but at least you took the shot." Gabriel's eyes lit up with excitement. "My exact words," Edward affirmed. Andrew looked at Edward. There was a flicker on his face, a relationship devoid of competition or animosity. It was about understanding. Andrew nodded in agreement. Edward blinked in surprise. "Thank you." Isabella alternated her gaze between the two men, a flicker of amusement in her eyes. The waitress returned with Andrew's drink and Gabriel's dessert. Without delay, Gabriel dove into his dessert, chocolate smeared on his chin, smiling after every bite. Edward used a napkin to wipe Gabriel's face. "Don't worry, mate. You seem to have more ice cream on your face than in your mouth." Gabriel giggled. "Wow." Andrew chuckled. "He has the same appetite as his mother." Isabella laughed. "Excuse me? Could you repeat that, please?" A smile appeared on Edward's face. He had never experienced such calm around the table. Resting in his chair, Gabriel looked tired, but satisfied. He looked towards Edward and asked if he could attend his school play. Suddenly, Gabriel posed the question. Edward's heart began to beat faster. He looked at Isabella. Isabella offered a faint smile. She informed him it would be next Thursday. Edward licked his lips. He affirmed, "Of course, I'll be there." A smile appeared on Gabriel's face. "I'm going to be a tree." Edward raised his eyebrows in surprise. Gabriel, with a proud expression, confirmed, "That's right, a tree. I show how I can stretch my arms." He demonstrated with the child's outstretched little arms. Edward chuckled subtly. "That sounds like a very important role." "It is," Gabriel replied solemnly. "I'm looking forward to seeing it," Edward commented. On the opposite side of the table, Andrew's gaze remained resolute. "Me too," he said. Edward's jaw tightened slightly. However, to his surprise, Andrew's gaze was not challenging but understanding. Leaning gently forward, Andrew murmured in a low voice, "Listen, I know this has been difficult for all of us. Edward, Andrew, and Isabella are both here now." Andrew affirmed that Gabriel's happiness was the most important thing. "We both care for his well-being. That's the main issue." Edward felt his chest tighten with tension. Andrew hesitated before resuming the conversation. "I won't argue with you about this." Edward's breath hitched. Andrew's gaze sharpened. "I won't let him down." Edward gritted his teeth with determination. "I don't intend to." Before giving his approval, Andrew scrutinized him. Gabriel yawned again and leaned back against Edward's side. Edward offered a gentle smile, tenderly stroking Gabriel's hair. Watching them, Isabella's expression softened. Andrew leaned back in his chair, staring intently at Gabriel. In a more relaxed tone, "You know what?" Andrew said. "I think he could go far in football." Edward offered a faint smile. "Really?" Andrew nodded. "If he keeps up his dedication." Edward looked at Gabriel, who was beginning to doze off. Edward affirmed that they would make sure he did. Andrew held his gaze for an additional instant. Then, a smile appeared on his face. Gabriel shifted position. After opening his eyes for an instant, Edward felt a weight in his chest and asked tenderly, "Daddy?" "Of course, mate. Can we practice my kick tomorrow?" Edward's eyes burned, no doubt. A gentle smile appeared on Gabriel's face just before he fell asleep again. Isabella approached Edward and shook his hand. Watching Gabriel rest beside him, his heart swelled with emotion. As Andrew got up and put on his jacket, Edward nodded. "See you tomorrow." Later, Andrew's gaze rested on Edward's hand, which rested protectively on Gabriel's back. After a moment, Andrew offered a subtle smile and headed for the exit. Isabella leaned on Edward's shoulder and whispered if he would really go through with his plan. Edward's throat tightened. "Yes." Isabella's hand moved gently over his. "You're doing well." Edward looked at Gabriel, who rested peacefully beside him. A deep sense of gratitude filled his heart. Besides earning Gabriel's trust, he was also integrating into his daily life. Finally, after so many years apart and filled with remorse, he felt he was truly home. This is such a powerful culmination of Edward's journey. What do you think the future holds for this unconventional family dynamic? And what's the most important lesson you've learned about the long road to redemption and forgiveness? Share your thoughts below. At the back of the school auditorium, Edward stood with his hands in his jacket pockets, gazing at the numerous rows of folding chairs. The stage was adorned with colorful paper trees and cardboard animal figures, clearly indicating a performance by junior school students. Parents conversed in whispers, holding their phones aloft to capture the moment, while a soft murmur of excitement permeated the air. In Edward's chest, his heart pounded with a sharp ache. Isabella sat near the front with Andrew, both smiling as they chatted. Andrew's arm rested casually on the back of Isabella's chair. Edward hesitated briefly before approaching them. He didn't want to overstep, but he had promised Gabriel he would be there. It was Isabella who noticed him first. With a bright gaze, she gestured for him to come closer. "I've saved a seat for you," she said, patting the empty chair beside her. Edward raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Really?" Andrew looked at Edward, then at the empty seat. A knowing smile played on his lips. "Of course, mate." Edward hesitated briefly before taking his seat. Just then, the teacher's voice resonated through the microphone. "Dear parents, we're ready to begin." The lights dimmed and the curtain slid open. A group of small children crawled onto the stage in simple costumes. Among the crowd was Gabriel, wearing brown trousers and a green shirt, his arms outstretched at his sides. A smile appeared on Edward's face. "There's my boy." Gabriel looked towards the audience, his brow slightly furrowed, as if searching for something. Edward automatically leaned forward. "I'm here," he whispered softly. Gabriel finally spotted him. His face softened, and he offered a faint smile. Edward felt a sharp pang in his chest as Gabriel's shoulders relaxed. The performance began, and Gabriel delivered his lines flawlessly. He stood tall, his voice loud enough for even the audience at the back to hear. Edward's heart swelled with pride. "That's my boy," Edward whispered to Isabella. A smile appeared on Isabella's face. "Yes, he's amazing." As the performance concluded, applause erupted throughout the hall. When Gabriel took his bow, Edward rose from his seat and applauded enthusiastically along with the rest of the audience. The boy's face lit up as he saw Edward standing, a proud smile on his face. After the children left the stage, Edward walked to one side of the auditorium. Soon after, Gabriel rushed towards him. "You made it!" Edward knelt and extended his arms. Gabriel launched himself into his embrace, wrapping his arms around Edward's neck. "I found you." Gabriel's voice was muffled as he spoke into his shoulder. "I saw everything." In a hoarse voice, Edward said, "You were brilliant." Gabriel pulled back and smiled. "I was a tree." "The most impressive tree I've ever seen," Edward expressed. Gabriel's eyes sparkled with enthusiasm. "Do you want to stay for ice cream with us?" Edward's throat tightened. I wouldn't miss it for the world. Weeks later, after the school play, Edward stood at the edge of the football pitch, hands on his hips, watching Gabriel run after the ball. In autumn, the sweet scent of freshly cut grass mingled with the cool breeze, while the warm afternoon sun cast long shadows across the landscape. Gabriel moved his short legs quickly as he dribbled towards the goal. Edward felt his chest swell as he watched his son so focused, his tongue slightly peeking out in concentration. Gabriel drew back his leg and struck the ball powerfully. The ball sailed into the net. Edward cheered excitedly, raising his fist in triumph. Gabriel turned, a radiant expression on his face, smiling towards the audience. He ran towards Edward with open arms. At that precise moment, Edward bent down to catch him. "You did it!" Edward wrapped Gabriel in a tight hug, exclaiming, "Goal!" Gabriel struggled to speak from excitement. Edward, his chest swelling with pride, affirmed, "What an amazing shot." Andrew approached, running from the opposite end of the field, clapping, "Excellent shot, mate!" As Andrew ruffled his hair, Gabriel smiled. Edward thanked his father with a smile that didn't fade. Although the term "dad" still brought a mix of intense emotions, this time he didn't experience the same level of pain as on previous occasions. Andrew gestured towards Edward with his hand. "Excellent practice session." Edward briefly hesitated before accepting Andrew's handshake, applying pressure firmly but gently. Andrew's gaze softened. "I can't believe you're doing this," Andrew murmured. "Be present. How good it is to be here." Edward felt his chest swell. "Of course," he affirmed. "I won't leave this place." Andrew's wide smile grew even wider. Gabriel excitedly grabbed Edward's hand. "What a good idea. Let's get ice cream." Edward chuckled subtly. "Ice cream again?" Gabriel smiled. "It's a tradition." From the side, Isabella's voice, suggesting, "Ice cream sounds perfect." Edward turned towards her. Isabella stood, hands in her jacket pockets, looking calm and happy. Andrew approached and stood beside her. Edward urged, "Join us!" The words flowed naturally. Isabella smiled. The four of them walked together towards the car park. As he skipped between them, Gabriel held Edward's hand with one hand and Andrew's with the other, swinging his arms back and forth. Edward and Andrew exchanged calm glances, a look that no longer reflected competition or nervousness, but understanding. They settled at a table near the ice cream parlor window. Gabriel sat in the middle, expertly holding a chocolate ice cream cone with colorful sprinkles. Edward sat at one end, while Andrew sat at the other, and Isabella sat opposite them. Gabriel tasted his ice cream, then smiled at Edward. "We can practice more tomorrow." Edward's throat tightened. "Of course. Do you plan to attend my next match?" Edward smiled. He expressed, "I wouldn't miss it for the world." Isabella's eyes gleamed with emotion. She reached across the table and squeezed Edward's hand. She tenderly whispered, "From now on, you're part of his world." Edward felt his chest swell with emotion. He replied with a squeeze of her hand, expressing, "It's all I've ever wanted." Gabriel rested his head on Edward's forearm. Edward smiled and tenderly embraced his son's small body. For a long time, this was what he had longed for. This was what truly mattered. After years of chasing wealth, power, and success, he finally understood that nothing surpassed the thrill of hugging his son. Nothing could compare to the joy of hearing Gabriel's laughter or experiencing the warmth of his tiny hand clutching his own. Edward had made serious mistakes. However, life had given him a new chance, one he wouldn't squander this time. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect on what truly matters in life. Edward painfully realized that success and fortune are worthless if you neglect those who love you along the way. There's always time to correct mistakes, to be present, to listen, and to support those who matter most to you. Gabriel didn't need Edward to be perfect. He simply needed his presence. And this is a lesson we should all seriously consider. There are always new opportunities in life, but it's crucial that we identify them and have the courage to take advantage of them. If you've ever felt yourself drifting away from someone significant, perhaps now is the right time to reach out to them. Perhaps now is the right time to show up, just like Edward did. Sometimes, simply being present is enough to reclaim what has been lost. I'd love to hear more from you right now. Have you ever felt the need to restore a relationship or reconnect with someone after a long period of estrangement? How did it go for you? Tell us about your experience in the comments section. I read every one, and your experience might inspire someone else going through a similar situation. Don't forget that. If this story moved you, click the like button and share the video with someone who might benefit from hearing it. Your support has a greater impact than you imagine. If you're new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications to stay updated on our next emotional story. Many more inspiring and motivating journeys await us in the near future. Thank you for being here, and remember that it's always possible to recover, reconnect, and choose love.